Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Therapist Theater, the podcast that takes a look at relationships and mental health through the lens of movies, TV, and pop culture. My name is Josh Treese, and I'm a therapist here in Nashville, Tennessee. Just wanted to let you guys know about 4 quick things before we get to this week's episode. First, the podcast is now available on some other platforms besides Apple Podcasts. You've got your Google Play for the listeners who have an Android phone. You've got your Stitcher. You've got your Spotify, and I'm putting the show up on all of these platforms in hopes that everyone who wants to listen to it can. So if you've got a friend or a loved one who you think would enjoy the show or would benefit from hearing something that we discuss on it, share it with them on their favorite platform. Just go to any of the previously mentioned spots and search Therapist Theater. And speaking of searching Therapist Theater, there's 2 new ways you can reach the show. The show's got a Twitter. Just open up your Twitter machine and go to @TherapistTheater. That's TherapistThtr. Had to abbreviate the word theater. Or if you want to get the show's attention without adding us, you can use the hashtag #TherapistTheater, spelled out all the way. The Twitter's a place where I talk about the movie Leanne and I are watching for the next episode that I'm working on, or one that we were just recommended and are just checking out. I also put out some polls and ask for your feedback, so make sure you follow us. We've also got an email you can reach us at. That's therapisttheater@gmail.com. Which leads to the third thing. We're going to be having a new segment on the show starting very soon where myself and the guest therapist answer your questions about relationships and mental health. So, as of the release of this episode, you can email the show at therapisttheater@gmail.com and ask a question about a relationship or mental health issue from a movie on an episode that we've done, or just a question that you just want answered. And the guest and I will do our best to provide an answer. We won't use names on the question, so you don't have to worry about being identified. So send in those questions to therapisttheater@gmail.com. Finally, at the end of each interview with our guests, I always try to take time to let you know where you can find them. I do that just in case you're looking for a therapist to see and feel like you might connect with them and want to see them as a client. But I haven't ever told you guys how you can get a hold of me in case you want to come see me. So if you're interested in becoming a client of mine, you can visit my website at mountsparrowcounseling.com. That's MOUNTSPERO counseling.com. So I think that just about does it for all of our housekeeping details. This episode is one I'm excited about because I have Aaron Karr as the guest. And throughout my whole master's program, Aaron and I were table buddies. So he's someone that I walked through my degree program with almost literally shoulder to shoulder. So let's dim the lights, raise the curtain, and start the previews. Welcome to the theater. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I wanted to kind of ask you some things about yourself, give some context to the listeners about kind of who you are and what you do. Just kind of starting with, you and I have been on the same track since getting into the degree program, but how did you get there? Like, what was it about therapy that made you decide, hey, I want to get into this?
That is a great question. It's hard to know where to start. And I won't give you my whole life story because it'll take too long.
I was born at a very young age.
Yes. At 0.
Yeah.
Let's see. I have, for a long time, wanted to have a career that was of help to people in one way or another. And I have dabbled in various other avenues to be helpful to people before therapy, and slowly realized that The context where I want to be of help to people is pretty small, pretty intimate, 1 or 2 people at a time. So prior to therapy, I was in teaching, which I really loved, and I kind of miss it. But I just slowly realized my venue is not 20, 30, 40 people at once. It's like 1 or 2.
Is that a personality thing?
That's a good question, too. Probably partly. Not the most charismatic public speaker you've ever met. But that's not what teaching's really about anyway.
It certainly helps, though.
It does help. I think it has to do with also with my slowly changing my mind about how change works and how making a difference works, and how that might fit with what I care about and what my skills are, and like you said, my personality also. I think change can work on the grand scale of, new ideas or political movements or something like that. It does all the time. But change also happens on the person-to-person level, and it's endlessly fascinating. A lot of times when I'm working with therapy clients, I'll tell them I don't have a manual for how to do this. If I had like the parenting manual here to help you with the parenting problem you've come in with, I would just give it to you. I'd probably charge you a lot more than I charge for
that'd be an
for a
expensive
session.
book, but yeah.
But the premise is there. But actually, I'm kind of glad there isn't a manual in a lot of ways, because this process of working with people and change and growth and development on this very small scale is a constant source of surprises, and I've gotten a huge kick out of that process.
Yeah. Do you think that, like I'm hearing you say the one-on-one, the small, I don't know if group would be the right word there, but the chance to do a little bit more intimate work with somebody to make a difference is appealing. Do you think that it's appealing that, the change process in therapy is a little bit, I don't want to say the word long-term, because it's certainly not like, it doesn't have to be a infinitely ongoing process, but it is more of a journey than when you go to see the doctor for strep throat and you get a prescription for amoxicillin. Like, is that appealing as well, that you get to kind of slow walk with people on their change journey?
Yeah, I'm a very process-oriented kind of person. You've probably got to know that about me when we were in grad school, but I'm the guy who takes 10 minutes to make my cup of coffee in the morning, because I just really enjoy the process of.
You just brewed from a Keurig in your office.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah, I want to change that. Actually, it's funny you say that, but I totally would have. But I ran out of beans yesterday, so Keurig it is today. I really just enjoy the process, the unfolding. I enjoy when I make a cup of coffee, unless it's a Keurig. It tastes different every time.
Huh. Okay. So, you've got this fit in therapy with, kind of how you like to, I don't know, deal with people on an amount level, as well as kind of a pace of it. And then that makes it sound like you really enjoy I guess the word would be the diversity of it. Just, each person's different. Each person's journey is different.
Yeah.
And it's not really like therapy is not like a factory. Like, you're going to crank out a client that looks the same every time.
Yeah. And I think my practice reflects that. I see a wide variety of people, and I work with individuals and couples and families, and I don't so much approach it as like, I'm the guy who can help you with whatever, insomnia or something like that. I appreciate that people come here for different reasons, and have different hopes and goals in this process. And I am, like I keep saying, endlessly fascinated that it's possible to work with such a variety of people.
Yeah.
So for that, I'm really grateful. I think after lots of exploring, trying to figure out where I might be of help to people, I think I found something that really is a good fit for me for those reasons.
Nice. Something I was thinking about I wanted to ask you today is, just from knowing you personally, I know that you have an undergrad degree in economics.
Mm-hmm.
That is just something that I don't know of any other therapist that has something like that. Does that contribute at all to how you view people, to how you work now, or is that just kind of remnants of a past life?
That's a great question. I studied economics for the same reason that I was in teaching, and the same reason I'm in therapy now. It's that I wanted to be of help to people. So I never thought about that before, but the history of it is, I wanted to be of help to people, starting with I want to be of help to everyone. I'm going to study economics.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
You went from like wanting to help everyone, and now
And then a
it's more of a
classroom.
laser focused on
Yeah.
one person sitting across from you.
Yeah. It was like, I want to be a part of economic development in developing countries. That was where that sort of spark happened.
Yeah.
And then it was, I really want to help a classroom of kids. And then it was like, maybe one person is my venue. So
Wow.
Interesting you brought that up. But does economics as a field come into play in therapy? It probably does. I don't know if I could avoid it. One of my professors in undergrad said, our main goal is to try to help you think like an economist. And if we can do that in 4 years, then you've got a great start. And so I probably do still think like an economist from time to time. But yeah, how would that play out in therapy? That's a great question. Probably thinking about unintended consequences is very conducive to therapy as well as economics.
Mm-hmm.
So I was well versed in those kind of ideas before I got into therapy, but something that happens with problems in people's lives, regardless of the scale, is that if you try to jump in and just go straight to fixing without understanding the whole context and the situation, you might wind up creating a new problem.
Mm-hmm.
And then whether you solve the original problem is, still going to be a matter of debate too.
Yeah. I think about what's the Freakonomics,
Mm-hmm.
where, I think originally seeing the cover of that book, seeing the title of it, I thought, oh, cool, math, boring. But then the more that I kind of dove into it, it ends up being more about what you're saying. There's a lot of systems thinking in it.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, like nothing exists as an island, but is affected by things metaphorically above it, and affects metaphorically things below it.
Mm-hmm.
And all kinds of things can shape the way that people make their decisions, can shape the way that people choose or don't choose consciously what action that they want to take. And I think that could certainly apply to therapy,
Mm-hmm.
especially with like you and I coming from the background of marriage and family therapy, where, having to choose so early on in the program, do you want to go that way? Do you want to go more the licensed professional counselor way? And
Right.
I remember at the beginning thinking like, I want to keep my options open because I'm just starting and I don't know.
Right.
And
Haven't even learned anything yet. How am I supposed to pick?
Yeah, and you have to pick. And then even like the second class that we took, them saying, now it's time to pick your specialty. And I was like, I just got here. I don't know where the bathroom's at. How do I make these big decisions?
Yeah.
But I mean, I think coming from that kind of background and studying deeply, a person doesn't exist as an island unto themselves, but rather as a part of a complex system, and the system that can include the family that they came from, their family of origin, as well as the family that they have created with
Mm-hmm.
their spouse and their kids, as well as the group of friends they have, the workplace environment that they're in. And each system can have different effects on that individual, and each system can be affected by that individual. And so it's a pretty complex idea that sounds a lot like economics. I mean, at least a cousin of economics, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. There's definitely a lot that they share in common when it comes to, the inner workings of people and context coming together. And more recently in the economic world, there's been the development of behavioral economics, which is pretty interesting stuff, but it's taking one piece of the study of economics and looking at it a little more closely. The classic assumption you have to make, or people thought you had to make in economics, was that if people have all the information, then they always choose what's best for them. And so if we can just assume everybody's choosing what's best for them, then we can come to a lot of really compelling conclusions about how, larger systems work. And behavioral economics takes a look at that piece and undermines it a little bit. As you may know from your seat, as a therapist yourself, like, people don't necessarily operate in their best interest at all. And so if that's one of the underlying assumptions in this whole field, then, it calls into question lots of things. I was kind of lucky in that I was studying in economics at the same time as the 2007, 2008 collapse of things. And so suddenly people were looking around for alternative ideas because it was pretty clear that lots of people in those days were not acting in their best interest at all. They had plenty of information and they were still doing crazy things. Mm-hmm. So in that way, I would say that has been very shaping of my approach to therapy and my learning.
Well, I think that's an interesting idea because I think that it's a pretty typical belief. And I think especially in a lot of religious circles that, a person at their core is going to act selfishly. Mm-hmm. They're going to act to protect what they believe is best for them. So when you're saying that people don't necessarily always act in their best interest, does that jive with that idea, or does it mean something maybe slightly different? Could a person believe they're acting in their self-interest, but really not be?
Freud talked about this at length a long time ago.
I was told to disregard Freud on the first day of class.
Disregard at your peril is what I would say.
I think that Dr. Hopkins' exact words were, "Hey guys, Freud's on page 19. Just know when he was, and then we'll move on."
That's not bad advice. But he was also really onto something, and one of his sort of kooky ideas was the death drive, which is that for some reason, from his point of view, it seemed like people were somehow driven toward their self-destruction. That might not be the only force in a person's life or the only desire in a person's life, but I guess the way I would put it these days is that we're all a big jumbled mess of all kinds of desires and drives in our lives that we might never really fully understand or account for. And I wouldn't be too surprised to find something like the death drive somewhere in that mix.
Yeah. I mean, I think that I can identify with that because I know that, like, in my past, there have certainly been relationships, and I mentioned really briefly in a previous episode that in where I come from as a therapist is an attachment theory place. And so I know that in the past, and I'm thinking like, years and years and years ago, 10, 12, 13 years, if I felt like a relationship that I was in, there was a distance growing, I didn't feel connected, maybe I felt the impending doom of a breakup, about to happen, or even not necessarily like a romantic relationship, maybe even in some of my family relationships, I remember thinking, well, fine, I'll just blow it up.
Yeah.
And then doing something that would inevitably end it. I guess not that in the case of the family stuff, but like certainly make the person angry. And just thinking, well, if I can't have it, I'll destroy it, which I mean sounds very supervillain. But I mean, I remember thinking that and thinking it on a conscious level, like knowing, oh, this thing I'm about to say, this is the blinking red button with the glass case on top.
Yeah. It's no surprise that there's supervillains, like we made them, and they must have some degree of resonance with us, whether it's just an object for you to get to hate or something you might identify with. But of course there's supervillains because look at us.
Yeah.
We got all kinds of those identities, I think, within us. But, you know, I can think of times in my life or in clients' lives where, you know, for some reason or another, there was like self-sabotage happening.
Mm-hmm.
It's a fairly easy sort of theme to pick up on, especially in retrospect. You know, you look back and you think, I just didn't turn that paper in class because I guess I didn't really even have any hope I would have made it through anyway. So why not just blow it up from the get-go?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, that to me sounds like I'm afraid that I'm not going to do a good job, so why should I bother trying? Or I'm not going to try, not why should I bother, but
Yeah.
I'd rather be in control of my failure than be out of control of my success.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is enticing.
Yeah. I like what you said about supervillains a second ago.
Yeah.
Because I think that one thing that's so appealing about, which, I mean, you know me, I'm a comic book nerd and a comic book movie nerd and just a nerd in general.
Yes, that
but
is true.
I think that one of the things that's most appealing about superheroes in general is this kind of fantasy of a virtuous fantasy of this is what I could be if I had all of my stuff together. And so I think that the idea of a supervillain, this is what I could be if I gave into my impulses, if I did what I wanted or looked out for myself, or if I had more power. You know, that kind of negative, I guess, negative reflection in fantasy is interesting too, which kind of leads to the next thing I wanted to ask you about. Like, as a therapist, you know, you have a worldview, you have a understanding of how you see the world and how you think change happens in people. And for you, unless this has changed, it would be narrative therapy. Tell me a little bit about, you know, what's narrative therapy? You know, why did you pick, I don't know if pick's the right word, but why was it that fit so well with how you understood the world and how you wanted to work with people?
Well, there are lots of different approaches to the therapy process. And for the most part, they have to do with thinking about, you know, what are people about? What are the sort of constituent parts of people, or how are people moving around in the world? What sort of things might lead to problems? And the narrative therapy approach to that is that people already have meaning-making skills. People already have values and purposes in their lives, and it's not my job to give meaning to them or to give them a better set of values or purposes that they should lead their lives by. It's actually my job to help employ those meaning-making skills, put them to work when it comes to whatever problem might be coming up in their life.
Do you think a person's always aware of what those meanings are in their own life?
I would say pretty seldom are they aware.
So then maybe part of your job would be helping them kind of discover what values do you hold, what meanings do you hold in your life, like a sifter. And then once you identify those, laying those down.
Then start trying to put the pieces together, figuring out, well, if this is what really matters, then how might that inform the next steps you're taking in your life? Or how might that inform your relationship with conflict or depression or anxiety or addiction or whatever it is that brought you in here? So I don't see my role as like a physician who's here to assess the patient and figure out the problem and then perform the surgery or the intervention and fix it, and that the patient's job would just be to lay still and let me do my thing. I see my job as more of like a co-author or an editor or a ghostwriter or something like that. Like you've come in here with a story, and the pieces might not all fit together, and there might be some pretty important parts that aren't here yet. And it's my job as a somebody who knows a thing or two about writing stories to help you develop this story of yours into something a little more lifelike, a little more fleshed out. One narrative therapy theorist put it pretty well. His name's Michael White. He put it pretty well when he said that a lot of the times problems that people have are a result of impoverished lives. And he doesn't mean necessarily financial poverty, but poverty in terms of ideas about the options available to them, or different roles I might be able to play. If a story of one's life is just really flimsy, it makes it pretty hard to overcome difficulties.
Yeah.
A little too flat, not lifelike enough.
Yeah. I remember when I was a client in therapy myself, that coming into the understanding that I had agency over my life was such a giant mind opener for me.
Yeah.
'Cause I think, you know, there's some terms in therapy, internal and external locus of control, which just means, like, if I have an external locus of control, I believe that things happen to me and I don't have any ability to change them. If I have an internal locus of control, I believe I have power over my circumstance. Now, that doesn't mean that it's ultimate power, that I can, you know, snap my fingers and make whatever I want to happen, but it just means that I have a voice, I have agency, and I have the ability to decide what, you know, I'm only in control of everything from my skin inward. And so I have the ability to decide as to what I'm going to do with that. And so for me as a person, you know, I remember coming to the point in therapy where I had this epiphany that, oh man, life doesn't have to suck. And I can choose what my life looks like. And so with narrative, at least what I'm hearing you say, and I think this is what was so appealing to me about narrative in the program as well, is that you get a chance to zoom out a little bit, look at where you are in your life, and kind of go, you know, how's this working out for me? Is this shaking out the way I like it to? And then I think the way that I phrased it, you know, when we were in school was, you know, zoom out. If you were a character in a story that you were writing, you know, what would you want that character to do next? Now go and do it. And I think that so many times we as people don't realize that we have that ability. We just kind of go with the flow.
Yeah. Yeah. One of my favorite kind of conversations to have in the therapy process is about relative influence, kind of going back to your idea about agency. You know, this idea, I think, has been around in psychology for quite a while, but I think the relative influence way of talking about it is a way I really prefer, because I think it's more humane than other approaches. But essentially, it's an opportunity to get to say, there's a problem in life and it's got some influence over you. So let's kind of map that out. Let's figure out, how does, just for example, social anxiety have an influence over your life? And those could be positive or negative influences. Like, not too long ago, I heard from somebody that social anxiety gave them an excuse to stay home, and sometimes they just want to stay home. That's pretty cool. So it doesn't always have to be a bunch of symptoms or something like that, but they're probably in there too, because social anxiety is no joke. And taking a look at those influences that social anxiety might have can be pretty informing when it comes to, you know, what do we have to work on, and how can we approach these things. And then there's a chance in the relative influence conversation to flip the script and say, well, what influence do you have on social anxiety? Because there's probably some. That's one of my starting assumptions when it comes to working with people in this context is that we probably have some limited influence over our lives. The existential therapists call it freedom, and they what they mean by that is that no matter what you do, no matter how bad it is or how good it is, you still have a say in how things go in your life. And there's nothing you can do about it.
One thing that I heard you doing right there, which is a technique of narrative therapy, is using social anxiety as an example. It sounded like you were kind of externalizing the problem there by talking about, what influence does it have over you? What influence do you have over it? It's something that, and I think, in my work, I'm a little bit more, I say a little bit more like it's a comparison. It's not. I am integrative.
Yeah.
In that I take pieces from narrative, I take pieces from EFT, emotionally focused therapy, I take pieces from experiential, and I take pieces from the spiritual root system that Chip Dodd, another therapist here in town, came up with. But this was something that was always the most appealing to me about narrative, was externalizing the problem. And I think especially because a lot of my work is with addictions, because there's so much shame that comes into play when it comes to that particular issue, to help a person externalize that from themselves and realize you're not a bad person who's trying to become good, you're a sick person who's trying to become well. And I remember, like, in our classes, I think when Dr. Leahy was kind of talking about externalizing the problem, she was using depression and would say things like, and it was little incremental tiny steps to help externalize it. So, hey, how often does depression show up at your house? When depression shows up, how long does it stay for? What's the feeling in the house when depression is your guest? If you could tell depression how long they could visit for, how long would you say they could visit for? How does depression affect the space in your home when it's sitting in the living room? If you had to give your depression a name, what would it be? All right, when Steve is here in the house, and just kind of slowly moving from this abstract concept that is so tough to deal with because you feel like it's a part of you on a cellular level, to, this is something that you now have, agency in how to deal with. And that's always something about narrative that I've really loved, is taking something that maybe doesn't have a physical form and putting it in the context of your story as something that you can interact with.
Yeah, and it can be powerful. I have endless examples of surprising externalizing conversations, but the gist of it is to remember that people are people and problems are problems, and a lot of times we get those mixed up.
That is so simple, but I love it so much, because I think that especially in relationships, we as people get that blurred all the time.
And I think it happens at the level of language. I think that's how that thing sneaks in. In the history of psychology, I would call this sort of an unintended consequence, going back to those economic terms. But in our field, we were trying to help people, and one of the unintended consequences was that we accidentally characterized people as deficient or incapable or somehow flawed. And
we pathologized them.
Yeah, if it weren't for, our very smart intervention, then they were probably doomed. And something that I really enjoy about narrative therapy is that it takes that into account in the approach, and that it's an approach that's very bent on humanizing people and avoiding dehumanizing at all cost.
Yeah. Would you say that it empowers them? Because I think from what you were saying earlier about your role being a editor, a co-author, a ghostwriter, what I'm hearing in that is that in the room, you may not always or ever take the lead, that your end goal is to help the client pick up the pen and learn how to write their own story better. So would you say that, I mean, like part of your practice, part of narrative is just empowering the client to discover their own agency and to have the courage to pick up the pen and live life how they want to live it?
Yeah, that's pretty well put. I think what I'm discovering in this process is that not all power is the same kind of thing. And there's something extremely important about personal power. It's a lot different than political power or financial power or scientific power or power of knowledge or something like that. But it's got its own place in our story, and part of my job is to help bring that to bear also.
Yeah, that's cool. I know that that viewpoint could really factor in the episode that came out before this one on the movie Moonlight.
Oh yeah.
I mean, personal power, a giant theme throughout that movie. Talking about narrative therapy, I think steers so beautifully into the movie that you wanted to talk about this week.
Yeah, let's nerd out.
Yeah. So I wanna give a spoiler warning right now. I'll time code this once the episode comes out. But if you haven't seen Arrival and you're listening to this episode right now, just pause it here. If you are the type of person who doesn't want spoilers. I am a spoiler junkie. I'm the spoiler king. My wife hates that about me. I want every spoiler for every movie that I walk into. When I read books, if it's a fiction book, I read half the book. Then I read the last chapter. Then I finish the rest of the book.
That's a big self-disclosure.
It is, yeah, and
laying it all out there.
Yeah, and some people would say, "Josh, you're a terrible person," and to those people, I would say, "Stop pathologizing me. That's not your role." But it's just a lot of like, all right, cool. I want to know where we're going, and then I want to know how we get there. But so if you don't like spoilers, go ahead and pause the podcast, watch Arrival, and then join us again. And so from here on, we're living in Spoiler Town. Population, me and Aaron. So with Arrival, I know that so your original, when we were texting about this kind of idea of what you wanted to talk about, was something that I thought, I don't know if that's going to really work, just because the way that you phrased it was the primacy of language. So you went back to the drawing board, and then you came back and you just wanted to talk about the concept of change and transformation. And I think that in watching this movie, so we watched it last night.
Me too.
My wife and I.
Had to do a refresher.
Yeah. And I had watched some YouTube videos talking about the movie last year, whenever it was first out, or at least maybe first came out on video. Do you say video anymore? First came out on...
I think we call it Netflix.
Netflix or digital.
But we mean everything.
Yeah, when it first became available for public viewing outside of a theater. Maybe somebody can come up in their acrostic for that. I remember watching these videos, and then when I sat down to watch the movie last night, those weren't anywhere in my head. And so I ended up just coming at it with fresh eyes. And it's told in a non-linear structure, which I think if anybody out there has a similar personality type to me, I very much like structure. I very much like kind of a linear, there is a beginning, there's a middle, there's an end. I want to start at A and go through B before I get to C. And Arrival, though it doesn't show you that from the beginning, is not that kind of story.
Yeah, it kind of ends in the middle, doesn't it?
It kind of ends in the middle, yeah.
Yeah. You remember Memento?
Yeah.
It reminds me of that a little bit.
Yeah.
There's a second spoiler. Eh.
And I think that like in the cases of both of those movies, because I mean I love movies. I read a ton about movies, and I fall into the trap that I don't know if anybody else falls into this as well, but like you get told how good something is and how much you should love it, and then you see it, and if you have a different experience, you're just like, oh man, are my choices that I have to now pretend that I'm on board with what everybody else said about this, or that I have to go with what I think is the, not popular view, or do I just have to, I don't even know what the third option would be. But I think in the case of Memento, I think I saw it after Batman Begins, like kind of going backwards in the Nolan canon. And I just remember thinking, well, this is not as good as I thought it would be. And then with Arrival, I think, and another friend of ours, Jared, had built it up so much, and he'll be on a future episode too. But I remember, because I didn't remember anything from the YouTube videos that I saw, going through it going, what in the world is happening? Like, because I think that it is such a slow build that, and I would also imagine that watching it for a second time, knowing what happens, you could spot so many breadcrumbs that are laid down. Just the context of the story is so, the way it's told rather, is so different than anything else. We get introduced to the character of Louise, I guess in voiceover form at the very beginning. And she is just kind of narrating a bit about, I guess, just a little bit of exposition to kind of set up who she is, where she is, that kind of thing.
I think she starts out saying, she's talking to somebody, and she says, I always thought the story of you started at the beginning, but turns out it started before the beginning.
Yeah.
So here's the real story of you.
Yeah, that's actually, with several of these movies I've gone over, I end up with pages and pages of handwritten notes. With this one, I have like, I don't know, 3 inches of notes on this piece of paper. And that's one of the only things that I wrote down was that particular line. But now I'm not so sure I believe in beginnings and endings. There are days that define your story beyond your life, like the day they arrived. And I remember thinking, well, that's a weird line. I don't believe in beginnings and endings. What would Semisonic have even written their song about? What would Andy Bernard hit play on at the end of every workday in Scranton? And so, I mean, from right there, you kind of get set up. Which, I mean, watching it for the first time, I just had no idea. But you kind of get set up for what the story ends up becoming. So Amy Adams is Louise. She is a professor of linguistics, kind of thing. She teaches language at a college, and it kind of shakes out. Clearly, she knows many different languages. She is approached by someone in the military who asks her about a translating job that she did, and she says it was easy because she knew, I think it was Farsi. She's worked with translating Mandarin, so just a bunch of different languages. And from almost immediately in the beginning of the movie, this news report happens where it kind of sets the plot in motion, which was that, do they even call it aliens at the beginning? They certainly just say something has landed at several places around the world.
This, like, very other object just shows up.
I thought they looked like giant sunflower seeds.
Yeah, what did they end up calling them in the movie?
Shells?
Shells,
Yeah. So they show up, and then a general arrives in her office, asks her for help, because as it turns out, I think there were 12, right? 12 of these floating shells have landed at different places around Earth. And around every one of them, the militaries of each country have gathered in an effort to try to understand them. And so they say, hey, we need your help. We need your help communicating with these things. And he plays an audio clip of someone trying to do that. And it, the language that's in the audio clip is not it's not like any language that we would have on Earth. It's I don't know, groans, something along that line.
Yeah.
Maybe. So she's like, oh, I can't do it. I got to be there in person. And he's like, oh, no, you already did this thing for us where you translated audio. And she's like, well, it's because I knew that language. I don't know this language, so I got to be able to interact.
Mm-hmm.
So they take her to the shells. They journey up into one of the shells. And she kind of comes to the conclusion, like, yeah, trying to figure this out through auditory language is not going to work. So she begins to try to use written language. And through that establishes a basis of communication with them. And so now that they've got this basis of communication, that progressively increases.
Mm-hmm.
Where do they go from there?
So she slowly learns their written language.
What's that like? It's not
it's
left to right, right to left.
It's this sort of circle-based structure. It doesn't have a beginning and ending, and it doesn't have a grammar that goes in order. It's just a blob of words that all come together at the same time.
Which I thought kind of looked like when you have some coffee in your mug and you spill a bit and you put it down on a piece of paper.
Yeah.
The little ring it leaves. That was kind of there.
Yeah. And the premise that slowly emerges is that these beings don't have the same relationship to time that we do. It's not linear. Things occur all at once or in groups with these beings. Mm-hmm. And in the process of learning language, Luis winds up adapting some of those perspectives when it comes to time.
Yeah.
So, the science fiction part of it is that learning language lets her see the future.
That and the 7-legged aliens that are teaching it to her.
Yeah.
Heptapods.
I love 7 because it's just like everything we do is in 2s and 4s, and we have octopuses here. We got pretty close, but everything's like even numbers. So something with 7 legs, that's just like utterly foreign.
Huh.
Like, what in the world is that?
I wonder if there was any kind of like, I genuinely don't know this, like religious like symbolism in choosing that number, because I know that it's a significant number.
Yeah.
Like in Christian literature with the Bible and things like that.
Like Kabbalah and all that.
Yeah.
I don't know. Never thought of that.
At the beginning of the movie, in her expository kind of voiceover, she's also talking to her daughter. Mm-hmm. And something that she says to her daughter several times in voiceover is, come back to me, come back to me, come back to me. Mm-hmm. And you see these little bits spliced in through the movie of her daughter's life. I think her daughter's name was Hannah. Mm-hmm. And you see fairly early on that her daughter died of cancer. And then as you continue to move throughout the movie, she's having what you think are flashbacks to the process of her daughter dying. Mm-hmm. And so I would describe her character in the movie as a bit stoic. Mm-hmm. And, as you're seeing these, what you think are flashbacks, you kind of assign meaning to them of, oh, she's in grief. She's in shock. She's a little bit frozen because she just lived through a tragedy of losing her child. But then as you progress through the movie and she learns more of the aliens' language and she begins to understand it more, what you then learn is just what you said. She has taken on the ability of these aliens to interact with time in a way that's non-linear. In one moment, she could be experiencing the future, which, even in the ability to live time non-linearly, you have to tell the story to us linearly. So she's in a moment that's in the future, then she's in a moment that's in the present. Mm-hmm. And as the story of her and her daughter are told, and the story of the world and the aliens are told, I don't want to say sequentially, concurrently, I guess is the right word.
Yeah.
You also begin to get bits of another piece of the future of how she ends up, I guess, saving the day is the right word. Mm-hmm. And it kind of reminded me a little bit of Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure to bring another completely kind of movie into it.
How so?
Where, have you seen that? Did you watch that when you were?
Oh, when I was a kid, yeah.
Yeah. So they discover in that movie that if they have a problem that they can't solve, they just, I don't know if they have to say it out loud, but they're like, oh, I'll just leave the keys to the time machine right here when we get out of jail, and they'll be ready for us when we get to this moment. And then they look down and like, oh, there's the keys. And they have to like remember in the future to do the thing that they said they're going to do to end up helping them in the present.
Nice.
Which I feel like.
So the first time around, they're like, whoa, where'd these keys come from?
Yeah.
And then the second time around, they're like, oh, we did that.
Yeah, we did
we
that.
We will have done that.
They realize they have to remember to do it, or else, you know, I don't know, some kind of time loop's going to happen.
Yeah, the universe will end or something. Yeah.
So in the movie, each of the shells have landed at different places on Earth. Each government has attempted to establish communication in a different way, which results in them assigning different meanings to what the aliens are trying to tell them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think at one point Louise, identifies a certain word as either meaning weapon or tool, and the military in China just and I think she says they're using mahjong tiles with this. And so, the words that they're identifying are victory, defeat, weapon, things like that. And so they, I think naturally from thinking and understanding that, freak out and say, all right, cool. So we need to prepare that these guys are here to destroy us. And so we're going to get them before, which sends the whole world into a panic.
Yeah. So, I really love that idea about, that connecting with these like totally alien things in different ways has different, outcomes. I think that's like so compelling. Let me see if I can unpack that. So one piece of the puzzle is that in our line of work, connection and compassion and understanding are sort of like the keys to the kingdom of therapy, right? Mm-hmm. That finding ways to relate to our clients and creating a space where our clients can be heard and understood is like the situation that we're developing in therapy for the most part. And it's powerful. And then on the other hand, something that's interesting about connecting with other people is that they're just totally different from us. And all of our attempts to relate to or connect with or understand them, they probably do something, but they'll always fall short. Like I can't really know what you really mean by what you say. But I can do something. So I guess what I'm getting at is I thought it was really compelling that all these different approaches to connecting with these aliens happened, and they were not all neutral in their effects, Different ways of connecting had different outcomes, but it wasn't as though Louise had the perfect way to do it, and if everybody just did it like her, then things would work out. But her way did seem to be better than playing the mahjong. It was a little slower, and it was a little more ambiguous. The Chinese approach in this film, they were sure that the word meant weapon, and Louise was stuck in this, well, I don't really know what it means exactly. I have to be kind of open-ended about it. It might mean tool, or it might mean weapon, or it might mean technology.
I think she actually said, let's go back and try to understand more. Which is an interesting approach. And I think one that's certainly less certain, I guess would be the right word.
Yeah.
I think, just kind of even talking about that, one thing I don't think I thought about when I was watching it, but I'm thinking about now is how much of us colors how much we understand from another person.
Yeah.
My story, my life, my context, how much of that is just a total colored lens that no matter what you say, what you do, what you are, it's a worldview that I'm going to see it this way because of who I am and where I've been.
Right. There's no view from nowhere.
Yeah.
You come from somewhere. Yeah.
And so naturally, the Chinese, in trying to understand the aliens from a certain viewpoint, received the message they were communicating as a certain message.
Right.
Whereas,
And mahjong is a pretty clever way to try to connect with somebody. Like, it's much more simple than trying to directly do it. You've got some kind of like simpler medium in between you.
yeah.
So
I don't know anything about mahjong.
I mean, it's like chess or
other than
dominoes
it was
yeah.
the game I never played when I had a PC. Like I
real.
always
Minesweeper's way better.
Yeah, it was always Minesweeper or Solitaire, and mahjong was something I accidentally clicked on and then had to like click off of.
That's so funny. Yeah, it was probably very expedient. It sounds like it would be.
Yeah.
To try to get something going with something just totally foreign to you, and get some traction, but it obviously had some unintended consequences too.
Do you think that Louise was able to kind of understand them better, maybe because of what we were saying about her earlier, like because of her stoic kind of, I guess, demeanor, personality? She's a little bit more of a blank slate, and so she didn't, at least for the function of the story, have as much baggage or backstory or, I guess, lenses to understand the communication through.
Yeah, her characterization in the beginning is pretty great, because like you don't get much from her just watching her go about her daily life before this thing happens, or as this thing initially happens, the arrival. She's just sort of blank.
Yeah.
The one thing I can think of that kind of gives some characterization is she's on the phone with her mom. You remember that scene? She's like coming home from school, and she's just learned that there's aliens everywhere, and she's talking to her mom on the phone, and her mom's kind of like freaking out a little bit, and she's just
asking a bunch of questions.
She's just like, "Mom, I saw the same news as you. I don't know what's going on either. No, I'm doing fine. I'll call you later." And that's like it.
Which
it's
is
like, wait,
which
what?
is the stock conversation with your mom on the phone.
Totally, yeah.
That,
except
like,
that
all of
aliens
us have
just
had
came.
it
Yeah.
some.
Other than
Yeah.
the fact that aliens came, it was like totally normal, mundane.
No, Mom, I saw the same news report you
Yeah.
did. I don't know anything else
Yeah.
different. Yeah.
It's so great.
Tell Dad I love him. All right,
Yeah.
bye.
I gotta call you later. I
Yeah.
have to go to the grocery store.
We were talking before we hit record about this video I'd seen on YouTube on a channel called Nerd Writer 1. And he made a video on this movie where he talked about something in film called the Kuleshov effect. And it's where we derive meaning from something that's shown based on the combination of shots in it. So he actually used the beginning part of this movie where she's walking in and is kind of a blank slate of expression. And because right before that part, they had shown these parts with her and her daughter being diagnosed, and there was a shot of her daughter with no hair laying on a table, probably having just died. And then you see her with a blank expression, and so automatically our brains go, oh,
This is grief.
she's in grief, she's in shock. And then when you get further on down the line, you realize, oh no, those were scenes from the future. Those weren't scenes from before where we first met her.
Mm-hmm. So
it just turns out she was a blank canvas for us to assign whatever meaning that we wanted on there. And so naturally, like if they would have shown something different before that part, what emotional state would we have said that she's in? When you are dealing with people who come in to see you and you're helping people in whatever particular page of the story that they're on, how do you help people find the meaning in what they're in? Because obviously it's not just going to be a matter of showing them a scene right before what they're in and them having this epiphany of, oh yeah, this is what I'm supposed to be feeling, this is what I'm supposed to be in. If somebody comes in and they say, this is the situation I'm in, you mentioned helping them find it. How do you do
it? Jerome Bruner is a psychologist that I've read some of and found his idea is pretty helpful. One of the things he talks about quite a bit is polyvalence in language and in life, and that term just means that anything, whether it's a word or a scene or a relationship or a life, an idea, whatever, anything like that is open to multiple interpretations. And there seems to be no getting around it. There doesn't seem to be a way in human life, and maybe in, any kind of life, human or not, to get to like the final answer. So, for Louise, and her experience, she goes through a process and ends up changing radically, and it reinterprets her life. And something that happens as the viewer is that we see this change happen, and it allows us to reinterpret what we saw. So that's like a 2 or 3 step process, right? Like I see something, I interpret it, I get some new information, it changes everything, I reinterpret what I interpreted before, on and on.
Sixth Sense, a great example of that.
Yeah, and we could go on and on with it. We watched Arrival, and we're going to, give some reflections and interpretations of it. And let's say this is a really exciting conversation and it's worth other people listening to. They will hear it, and they will have interpretations and reinterpretations of our conversation. Like this is a process that could go on forever.
Ad infinitum.
Without ever arriving at like the final meaning of something. So when I'm working with clients, that is a important feature of the process. I don't have an idea of what the meaning that they ought to assign to things is. And if I do, I don't put much stock into it in the therapeutic process because it's probably one of many. And whatever my idea is, might be interesting, it could be valuable, it could be helpful, but it also comes from my perspective, and it's got its own limitations, and one of the limitations of it is that it might not make any sense to the person I'm talking to. So is it really worth doing this huge amount of heavy lifting to get my particular interpretation across, when it might not even really be the compelling one or the one this person needs to hear? It could just as well be that my client can arrive at an interpretation with a little bit of my assistance that makes a lot more sense to them and has much more power. So part of the therapy approach, I think, is about working smart and not hard in that sense.
How do you help somebody discover meaning? That is the biggest philosophy. Like that. It's probably like an ultimate life question.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't be, hey, tell me a quick 3-step process. I mean, it's probably not that, but.
Are you familiar with Richard Rohr?
Yeah.
The Franciscan priest. He is kind of in some of the debates about meaning when it comes to Christianity, and I love his perspective on it. He said, God isn't a mystery that's unknowable. I mean, that's true. But God is actually a mystery that's endlessly knowable. And so when it comes to how would I approach endlessly knowable meanings with somebody, whether it's God or their life or relationships or something, my starting point is that that invitation is always there. And so it might take a little bit of sort of scaffolding or building a bridge to help people connect with that, but
creating some structure in which to understand it.
I'm not going to introduce them to the concept of making meaning in life in a way that like they didn't already have.
Yeah.
So it makes my job easier. When it comes to the how-to or how would I build a bridge, that's a great question. I think I ask questions in therapy about 80% of the time. It has to do with a lot of questioning.
Very Rogerian.
Very curious, and very open about what answers I might hear. And I'm always looking for the meaning-making process happening. And if I get a glimpse of it, then I'll try to bring it out a little more clearly.
It sounds very here and now.
Can be.
We're in the room. What we say in the room is the work.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not so much, tell me a story about when you... but it's just, it also sounds very personable.
Mm.
I often will tell people, hey, I think that you're the expert on yourself.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to be able to tell you something about you. I am just going to be curious and ask in an effort to try to know you better. And then as we walk this journey together, hopefully we can discover things kind of arm in arm. I love what you said about the infinitely knowable, because I think it ties into the movie so well. With the language that the aliens use, I think, they described it at one point as knowing how you're going to start a sentence and end a sentence and all the space you need to occupy in between, as if you could write with both hands, starting from both ends, coming inside.
Yeah.
And I remember when I was a kid, we went to some kind of like summer camp or something with our church, where it's like a week-long thing, and one of the pastors of the church came with us. And I remember talking to him about his understanding of what the afterlife is, his understanding of what heaven is. And he said, because he believed that God was, and I think this is this is a personality on display. He said, because he believes God's infinitely knowable, that you would get to spend eternity continuing your journey of knowing God. So, you may meet God at age 10 and then spend the next 70 years trying to know him as best you could on earth. And then when you die and are, glorified and spend eternity with him, that you would continue that journey in eternity. So, which you would never reach the end of. You could spend eternity, knowing this particular aspect of God. I want to understand his grace better. I want to understand his compassion better. What's the deal with sneezing? Like all kinds of, whatever it is, just an endless pursuit of intimacy with him. So that infinitely knowing, that's a really big concept, but I also find it really comforting. Like, I don't have to get everything in one, no pun intended, session.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have to figure everything out all at once, and I don't have to. And I think this is a personality trait that I have. I find so much security in knowing.
Mm-hmm.
If anybody that's listening is into the Enneagram, like, I'm a type 6, and so, my one of my biggest fears in life is the loss of safety and security. And one of the ways that I feel safe and secure is to have, knowledge. And so for me, to hear, hey, you don't have to have all the knowledge. You don't have to get it all in all at once. It almost, makes me unclench. Like, it always makes me relax.
Isn't it funny? It's always that two-sided coin of things, though, it seems like. On the one hand, it seems you don't get to know.
Yeah.
And it's like, ugh. And then on the other hand, you don't have to.
You don't have to. Yeah.
I don't get to, and I don't have to. I think it also changes the game. This totally applies to Louise, I think, in her process, too. But it changes the game from getting to the end point as the purpose and the meaning. So, her project, it seems, with the aliens is to understand them. And she does do that. But if understanding more and more and diving into this mystery of life more and more is not going to have an endpoint, then I've got to have some other sense of like goals or purpose or value that makes some kind of sense other than finally grasping the thing.
Yeah.
She has this slow process in the movie of getting closer and closer to the heptapods, physically speaking. She starts out somewhere in America, and then she ends at, takes the next step to the army base at the bottom of the shell, and then she goes into the shell, and then she meets them with a screen in between them, and then near the end of the film, she ends up on the other side of the screen. But even that experience of being very intimately with them is still unsatisfying and temporary and confusing. And so it seems like the goals or the values that are driving this process for her have got to be somewhere else. And it's got to be, in my mind, the enjoyment of the process. Mm-hmm. Like the endless unfolding has to have some enjoyment in and of itself, to give it some kind of juice to keep moving forward.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how I feel about the therapy process too. I am very interested in helping people address the problems or the situations that brought them in. And that does happen in therapy. But it's not always so cut and dried. And a lot of the time, enjoying the process or the journey for its own sake is a big part of the puzzle that can be easily overlooked.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not so much that therapy is for fixing people, because I would say nobody comes into therapy broken. Like, you're not less of a person. You're a person in the context of your own story, and I think narratively speaking, who just needs help understanding your story and maybe deciding to change the story a bit. I liked in the movie where as the movie progresses and you begin to see, hey, these little flashbacks aren't flashbacks, but they're flash forwards. You also see that not only is Louise's daughter yet to be born, but that Louise's marriage to Ian, the other scientist, is yet to come as well. Mm-hmm. And at the very end of the movie, when she comes out of the shell, her and Ian embrace, and she says to him, and this is when they're not yet married, but she says to him, I forgot how good it felt to be held by you. Mm-hmm. Which at that point in time, at least from what we've been shown, she had yet to experience.
That was the first time,
Yeah. And so she also kind of says the question, if you knew how everything was going to turn out, would you still choose, I don't remember the exact words, but would you still choose to move forward? Mm-hmm. Which is such a giant question. And strangely enough, one that in my own personal reflection, and I remember writing about this in journals, is a question that I've wrestled with a lot. Like, if I knew the future, would I still choose to walk towards it? Or even would you want to know the future? Mm-hmm. Is that something that you would want to have the knowledge of, that if events were going to turn out into a certain way, would you still even want to walk forward with those events? And it's certainly a giant philosophical question, one that I don't have an answer to. But
Nietzsche was one of the first people to formulate that question. His is called the infinite return, and it's the idea that someone really living the life well would be happy to do it over and over just how it is without changing anything. Mm-hmm. So can you imagine living a life in such a way that you would be happy to do it just how you did it?
Yeah.
You wouldn't tweak anything. You wouldn't change any choice. You'd just do it that way, because that was the life.
Yeah, it's weird that you even bring up that Nietzsche quote, because I read a Richard Rohr book one time, to go back to him, called Breathing Underwater, where he talked about the concept of forgiveness. And he said forgiveness is getting to a place where you don't wish for a better or a different past. Mm-hmm. And that to me sounds like it really jives with that Nietzsche idea. And I think that Louise gets to a place where she is able to engage with her own life more and begin to, I don't know. If you see the future, do you even have agency? Like, if you're just told this is what's going to happen, does that take away your agency?
Yeah, you're talking about something that connects with why I wanted to talk about change and transformation. Something profound happened to Louise, and she was totally altered in her well in every way, in her makeup, in her skills and abilities, and her approach to life, and her understandings of things, because of learning this language. I think this is part of it that's actually like it's all far-fetched in the story, but it's actually kind of makes some sense to me. When I've gone through transformations like that, they have a way of inviting me to radically reinterpret my life, my past, and my future. And also the experiences she's having, they're fanciful in the sense that she could tell the future. But they're also very realistic in the sense that she's experiencing them like memories. You know, we are all, assuming we're growing to old age, going to have a perspective in our lives at one point, which we'll be able to look back at the whole thing and have some understanding of it and see themes and ideas from that point of view. That
hindsight is 20/20.
Yeah,
like a simplified version of
that. Yeah, we will look back on life at some point, and we can do that now in a way that connects things that weren't connected before. So in that sense, she's not doing anything all that special, except that she's doing it early. But this change that's happened in her kind of throws this whole idea of free will like out the window.
Yeah.
Is free will a thing or not? From her perspective, is like a question that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, and I guess the way that they're experiencing it, everything's happening at once. She's still having to, I guess that brings to her a question. If you know how things are going to turn out, would you still choose to move forward? And she does. She still chooses to embrace Ian,
Right.
Which I guess puts her on the track to them becoming married, them having Hannah.
There's even a sense of urgency to do what she knows will be done.
Yeah.
Which sounds like a choice to me. So it's like both a choice and not a choice.
Yeah. Oh, and then there's even the part where she is telling Hannah the reason why Ian left is because she told him about Hannah's death before he was ready for it.
Mm-hmm.
And it made him angry. And he left because Hannah was, like a lot of children would, assigning the blame of her dad leaving to herself.
Mm-hmm.
And Louise is trying to comfort her, saying, no, that's not your fault. I know the future, and I shared it with him a little too early. He wasn't ready for it.
Yeah.
I do love the idea of engagement. I just love the idea of saying, this is my one life,
Mm-hmm.
and I am going to just wrench everything out of it that I can. And in the end, she ends up telling Hannah that the reason why she named her that is because it's a palindrome. It's the same forward and backwards, which kind of ties into her.
I think she should have named her a race car.
That is beautiful. Or Taco Cat.
Mm.
That's another. Oh, Taco Cat. It's time for bed. Like, Leanne, if you're listening to this part of the conversation, we're definitely naming our kid Taco Cat.
Yeah, it's 2 against 1. Sorry, Leanne.
There you go. We've taken a vote. It's the same forward and backward, which just ties into the explanation of the language from the aliens and her entire story and her whole journey.
Mm-hmm.
So you even see in that one part that the meaning that she was able to find in her experience, that she has taken it in, she's identified with it, and then she has even passed it on as a part of her legacy
Mm-hmm.
to her child, involving her in that, which is really, really beautiful, to allow yourself to be changed by something and to take it on and to help pass on that change to others.
Yeah.
That sounds a lot like what happens in a therapy room.
It's also reflective of how she winds up saving the day.
Yeah.
She doesn't get to pick how she saves the day.
It's almost presented to her.
Yeah, it's a happening that she's just a part of. And she does have some choice, and then it's also just something that happens.
Yeah. But she had to, I guess, allow herself to be present and
Mm-hmm.
engaged for that to even happen.
Yeah. Yeah, and yeah, that is something that happens in the therapy process over and over. It's part of what is so attractive to me about it and so fulfilling. and I'm lucky enough that it happens to me too as the therapist. There's this process of understanding in new ways over and over that interprets and reinterprets my clients, their lives, my work, my job, my relationship with my family, their relationships with theirs. We're entering into this process of engagement, mutual influence, although not the same kind of influence. And crazy things happen.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of coming back to this idea about change and transformation in the film. Something that really stood out to me was that the change that happens for Luis is very much a radical change. It's like a root level change is what radical means, is root. And it's surprising. It doesn't match up with what her original goals or intentions were necessarily, although she set herself up to be changed. And they weren't just a matter of like sort of putting a Band-Aid on the process. The military and the government just wanted her to be able to ask them one simple question.
What's your purpose for being here?
Yeah, what are you doing here? And that would have been a very small change in the situation, sort of like, you know, in the therapy world, it might be something like teaching coping skills. Like, you know, there's this problem of whatever, depression, and we're not quite to solving depression yet, but at least we can help you with like these 3 steps to like help cope with it. You know, call your mom, eat a good meal, get some sunshine, you know, those kind of things. Those things are great. That's not all that therapy is about. And that's what makes it compelling to me, is that if sunshine really does the thing, or if yoga, I recommend yoga to a lot of people when it comes up. Like, if yoga is enough to help with your problem of, you know, being out of touch with your body, or just getting some stuff flowing so that your brain chemistry can be altered a little bit, and that solves the problem, then by all means go do it. And if for some reason yoga's not doing it, that's where I come in. Because there is a much more radical kind of change that goes beyond the Band-Aid level.
Yeah. Wow. So Arrival. And here we have arrived at the end of our time. Thank you.
What did you think of it? Did you enjoy the movie?
Here's what I'm discovering in the process of doing this show.
Yeah.
Is that there are movies that when I watch them, I don't enjoy them. And then when I process them with somebody, I love them enough to buy it. Like, which, I mean, I think that this is a good example of that. Like, I remember us finishing the movie last night and being like, well, that was boring. Which is an oversimplification. But I mean, I think I said something like, you know, everything but the last 10 minutes didn't really matter. But then the more you dig in, and it's really the kind of the whole purpose behind this whole show is taking, you know, concepts of relationships and mental health, and then using something that we already have a framework for to better understand them. And so I think even just being able to process the movie with you and talking about change and agency and language and how much effect we have and can have in our own life, and how the change in us can affect others, I think, you know, has made me a giant fan.
So this is really just a podcast to help you build your movie library. Is
totally selfish, yeah. Absolutely.
I'm uncovering the real hidden process.
I am actually, and this was a giant change that happened from many years ago to now being in the present married life that I am. I used to have this giant DVD collection that was like, I mean, it was deep. Like,
I remember you talked about it in school.
Yeah, I had boxes and boxes and boxes,
like
and
400
boxes.
DVDs or something, right?
And then, I don't know about that many. My brother certainly has that many right now.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he's got a giant, like, 8 or 10 foot tall and just as wide bookshelf where almost every shelf is filled with DVDs now.
Wow.
And, you know, it's probably from moving into a very small apartment that I was just like, there's no room. I don't want these DVDs anymore. But then even that, like moving to a place of what is the end result of me owning all of these? How often am I going to watch? Like, and it's why I'm so afraid to collect anything, because I'm such a completionist that like at one point, I think
you can't just get the Fellowship of the Ring and it's done.
I got to get the extended and I got to get this. And I got to get that. Like at one point we were in school, I got the idea. I wanted to start collecting these like enamel pins because there were so many for pop culture I thought were so great. And then I thought, but what's the end result? I'm going to have a cork board full of 100 pins that are $10 each. I'm $1,000 deep into these things. Like,
here lies Josh Treese, incomplete pen collection.
Yeah. And so, for me, it's not so much about owning them as it's just, and I said this in the intro episode, and I think you're such a great person to even say this with. It's just, I love engaging in stories so much. So it's just a matter of how do we use the stories that are already so readily available in front of us to better understand ourselves, our relationships, and the issues that we deal with of mental health, our own mental health, and that of others. How do we use those stories to better understand that stuff? And so I think anytime I get to have a conversation with somebody where I walk out the other side better understanding the story of the movie, the story of that person, or the story of the people that they work with, like how could I not end up a giant fan? So hopefully at the end of this, it doesn't result in me owning like 1 million movies on iTunes. I don't think that we have the capital to make that happen.
Love it.
Yeah, it was so great to have you on to talk to you about this. If anybody out there wants to find you, let's say that they're in the Nashville area or in Tennessee and they want to see you as a therapist, where can they go?
AaronKarr.com. It's pretty simple. You got info there for my practice as well as contact info if you want to reach out. And all things Aaron happen at AaronKarr.com.
Boom. It's your one-stop shop for all your Aaron Karr needs. Well, thanks so much for being on.
It's been a pleasure, man. Appreciate it.
Awesome. So, Leanne, what'd you think?
I thought it was great. I thought you guys did great. I do, however, have a correction that I'd like to make.
A correction?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
You said some incorrect things.
Well, that's never happened.
That's not true. It happens all the time. The correction that I would like to put out there is from when you said that you love spoilers and I don't, and that I hate that about you. You said she hates that about me. So I would just like to say that I don't hate anything about you. I love you, and I don't like it when you tell me spoilers, but you also generally, for the most part, respect my wishes in terms of not hearing spoilers.
That's true.
Which I appreciate and love, and just because you're different from me doesn't mean that I hate you. It just means, or that I hate that part of you. It just means that that's one of our great differences that helps us balance each other out.
But there was the time, and I don't remember what this was for.
Also, you're wrong about it.
What am I
But
wrong
other than
about?
that, spoilers. They are not, you should not look for spoilers. You're wrong about it, but I don't hate it about you. That's what I'm trying to say.
Each person gets to decide that for themselves. But there was the time that, and I don't remember what it was for, there was the time that I said a string of things that were happening or that could happen in something, a show or something like that, and I actually said the spoiler as a part of one of the options of things that could have happened.
I know.
What was that for?
I don't remember.
Yeah.
Maybe Harry Potter, maybe Avengers.
No, it wasn't Harry Potter.
Well, I meant like Fantastic Beasts. Sorry.
Oh. No, because we've seen both those together.
Yeah, but you look up spoilers beforehand.
Oh, yeah. So I like said, oh, it could be this, it could be that, it could be this. And in the middle of it, I gave the actual thing and I listed a bunch of things afterwards. And then when we got to the actual part, you were like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that you actually.
Yeah.
And I was just like,
Well, I don't think you've done that since, because I truly, seriously do not want
but
you to do
is
that.
it a spoiler if you don't know it's a spoiler?
Yes, because that was in my head before I saw the movie, and I don't want there to be anything in my head. I don't want that. That meant that I had a list of things that I was expecting and waiting for any of these things to happen.
But isn't that
and
just
then one
like
of them
a menu
did.
at a restaurant?
It is, but I'm not going to a restaurant. I'm going to a movie. We need to move on.
Not at the dine-in theater
I s-
because you're getting both.
I started this
It's a
whole
great
thing.
value. Maybe we can get them to sponsor the show.
I started this whole thing just to say that the correction is that I've never said, and I do not hate, that you love spoilers. It's just a difference, which I appreciate and acknowledge as a difference. The end.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So, I mean, did you have any thoughts on the episode?
I did. Yeah. It was great. The movie was not what I expected, but to be fair, I had not really seen or heard anything about it other than that it won awards and it was good.
Did it win awards?
I actually don't know.
Yeah, I don't know
thought
either.
It did.
Maybe one of the listeners can fact check that for us.
Yeah.
Email us at therapisttheater@gmail.com.
I just mean that I had like heard of it and heard that people liked it and didn't really know much about it beforehand. But anyways, watched the movie, listened to you and Aaron. I thought it was super cool how you guys talked about how he started in economics and now is in therapy and like doing counseling. And it also, I just think you guys had a lot of cool parallels to the movie, like specifically in relation to things, starting from a big systemic level. I'm talking with my hands and he's giving me a weird look. Things starting on a big systemic level and then how that trickles down and impacts people or things on a more micro level. I personally just love that, and I like to nerd out about system things and how they impact individual lives and things like that. And so
you probably know more about that than both Aaron or I, because I mean, being in social work,
I don't know if that's
like
true.
that's what you deal with are these big systems where things can take place and then have individual impacts on individuals.
Yeah. Well, and honestly, when you guys talk about family therapy and how it takes into account the systems in people's lives, like that's what social work is as well. And like one of the ways that it got started was people differing from clinical counseling, or like I don't know if it was like
social work was around before counseling was.
I know, but like the difference being that they weren't just trying to work with the individual in the room. I mean, they were like, you could only work with the individual in the room, but they took into account person and environment is what it was called.
Yeah.
Like everything in their environment, including the larger systems that they were in. So anyways, all this is besides the point. I just really love talking about and thinking about stuff like that. And I thought, I just loved that you guys talked about it. And I came up with a new little saying, while you guys were talking. You and I say this a lot, that hurt people. So people who have been hurt tend to hurt other people. So my new saying is that changed people change people. And I thought that you guys' conversation was just a great, I think you guys talked about that, and I just came up with the saying for you. So you're welcome.
Thank you. Shirts will be available at this website later. We don't have a website. But.
No, I think this, I love the cut out on my stammering right there. I really like the idea of somebody going through change on an individual level and then them being able to, affect change in other areas. And I think that really applies to some larger systemic things in our world right now. Like even in our, politics, and then you could go into like the system of racism, and there's just all these systemic things that if we change individual people, and if individual people are changed, then that's how we can get the larger system to change. I don't think the larger system changes without having individual change first.
There's an old quote from Leo Tolstoy that actually Biggie Smalls used to say as well. And that is, everybody wants to change the world, but nobody thinks about changing themselves.
Huh.
And that to me is kind of a reverse to what you're saying, is that people who are willing to undertake the journey of change can have such an impact on on the rest of the world. And I think, and it's so interesting that you point that out, because I mean, I think that at least in my personal therapeutic journey, and I'm sure Aaron would say the same thing, it's not so much like, oh, you know, I went to therapy and I changed, and so now I want to go and change other people, so much as it was that I looked at the time that I spent in therapy as just a great gift. Like I was given the gift of being able to affect change in my own life. And so for me, it wasn't like, now I'm going to go out there and change people, so much as it was, I'm so overwhelmingly thankful for the gift. And I just hope that I can steward the gift well. And the best way I can think to steward it is to give it to other people, to help give it to them.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's, and I definitely, I mean, I hope that, I don't ever mean that you should go out and change other people or set out to change other people, but I think exactly what you're saying is what I meant. And I know at one point Aaron said, I wrote it down because I really liked the quote. He said, not all power is the same kind of thing, and personal power is really important. And I just thought when I heard that, oh yeah, like when people feel empowered, they're more likely to empower other people. And I just like that.
Yes. I think that there's a certain kind of like security and humility and stability that a person has to have if they're going to empower others. Because otherwise you're so scared of you would look at it as giving away your power, when it's not really that at all. It's helping another person to find theirs.
Yeah, which I would say, if you're thinking you're going to give away your power, that's not empowerment. That's a different kind of power, which is like what he was saying. There's different kinds of power. But yeah, I mean, I agree.
Cool.
That's it.
I don't know how to wrap this one up.
Just say thank you, and the theater's closed.
Oh, there you go. Guys, thank you so much for listening once again. And we'll see you back here next week. For now, the theater is closed.